Hello and welcome. Brilliant Oscar winner Glenda Jackson rose from a working-class background in the north of Britain to play the Queens of Scotland and England and win Academy Awards for Ken Russell's Women in Love and A Touch of Class opposite George Segal. Later in her career, triggered by her dislike of Margaret Thatcher's politics, she stood for the British Parliament, not only winning a seat but eventually becoming the nation's junior Minister for Transport. Glenda finally returned to acting in recent years after deciding not to stand again for Parliament. Her performances since have included an acclaimed role in 2019 as Shakespeare's King Lear on the Broadway stage, at the age, I might add, of 83. In a career spanning more than 60 years, Glenda has won 25 acting awards around the world and many more nominations in film, TV and on the stage. But back in 1982, she appeared opposite acclaimed actor Sir Alan Bates, American Anne Margaret, and Britain's Julie Christie in the powerfully emotional World War I film The Return of the Soldier. At the time, I caught up with Glenda at a London pub shortly after the film had opened and asked her how a young woman from the north of England found her way onto the world's cinema screens and theatrical stages, and about winning those Oscars.
Well, I was born in a place called Birkenhead, which is Liverpool's poor relation. It's on the other side of the River Mersey. And then when I was one, my parents moved to a place called Hoylake, which is about half an hour's drive away. And was then, it's all changed now, really a suburban dormitory for Liverpool. And it's on the sea. And it's just a very quiet little place, actually. I was related to practically everybody who lived there, because my father's family were fishermen, and so I was always bumping into cousins and second cousins and third cousins 5 times removed. And I did all the sort of perfectly ordinary things. I went to school, and then I went to grammar school, and then I left school with no qualifications whatsoever.
But any desire at that point to do theatre?
To act, none whatever. And I had to get a job, so I got a job in Boots Cash Chemists, where I was for 2 years. And then a friend of mine had joined a local amateur group and said, why don't you come along, because it's fun. And so I did, and somebody said, you should do this professionally. So I wrote to the only drama school I'd ever heard of, which was the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, and I went off and did 2 auditions because I had to have a scholarship because we couldn't pay the fees. And so I got a scholarship, and I got a grant from my local education authority, which was Cheshire. Thank you very much, Cheshire Education Authority. And there I was at drama school for 2 years training to be an actress.
And there was nothing in your background. I mean, growing up, kids do plays at school and so on, but you don't seem to have had that.
No, I didn't. I mean, I went to the theatre usually at Christmas to see the pantomime, and I went to the cinema a lot because there were 3 cinemas within easy reach of my house, and they changed their programmes every 3 days. So if I could get the money and the permission, I could, in fact, have seen a different film every night of the week, but that didn't always happen. And I had once appeared in a Sunday school, play, playing a crippled boy who had one deathless line, a star in the day. I can remember saying that. And that was really my only brush with the theatre.
Yeah. What does the family think now? Obviously, you've got still a lot of relations up north, I guess. Do they see...
Well, now that I've been gainfully employed for quite a few years, they're very pleased about it. But they did have 8 or 9 years when I would regularly go home with holes in my shoes, and they would all say to me, why don't you get a proper job? And I would have loved to have got a proper job, but I had no training for anything, and I had no qualifications. So when the luck came and I was employed as an actress 52 weeks of the year, then that was a great bonus for us all, actually.
And did they really find it very difficult to accept that the daughter of theirs had sort of gone into this strange world that was always sort of out there on the cinema or something?
Well, I think the most difficult aspect for my parents really was that I left home. I mean, we are a very close-knit family. I'm the eldest of 4 girls. And to leave home anyway was a bit of a pain for them. I mean, it was painful for them. And also to go off to London, where I had to go because that's where the drama school was and that's where all the employment possibilities were, was even worse because, I mean, it was then, they believed, the sort of Sin City of the Western Hemisphere, and there I was going off and heaven only knew what might happen to me. Nothing did, actually.
Damn it. How hard, though, was it in those days once you'd got through drama school to actually get a...
Very. I mean, it is the most painful, humiliating and degrading experience to say you're an actress and then actually try and get the work. I mean, there are a great many people. It's an overcrowded profession anyway. And the bias for female parts is non-existent. I mean, there are always fewer female roles than there are males, so you have the largest proportion of equity chasing the smallest proportion of work, and it's a deeply, deeply depressing experience.
And did you at any point think that it was all a waste of time and really that you could go back to Boots or whatever and be happy in another career?
Well, I did have 2 solid years when I didn't utter a single line of dialogue for anybody anywhere, and I really did think then that I mean, I didn't feel that I wanted to give it up. I felt that it had given me up. I mean, I'd had no opportunity to see if I could be what I said I was. I mean, how do you know you're an actress unless you're acting, really? And that was an extremely painful time. But then, for a marvellous woman called Miriam Brickman, who was the casting director at the Royal Court, had always tried to get me work. Was always putting me up for auditions at the Royal Court, and I never ever got one. And she got me a job in Dundee, I mean, which is a rep up in Scotland, because one of the members of the company had suddenly fallen out and they were desperate for anybody, really, and I got it, and that broke that 2-year drought. And, but that was a very painful time, very.
What about the biggest break for you? Pardon me?
Well, the biggest was a director called Peter Brook wanted to do a play by Jean Genet called The Screens, and it had a huge cast, and it was very complicated. It dealt with the Algerian-French War, and he felt that he needed a specific kind of acting to make the play work, and the way to do it was to get a group of 12 people who would act as a catalyst upon the remaining 36 that were required for doing the play. So I auditioned for him twice for what eventually became known as the Theatre of Cruelty. And we worked in the most extraordinary way. I had never worked like that before. It was a series of exercises and improvisations, and it was wonderful and very thrilling. And from that work, I was co-opted into the Royal Shakespeare Company. And then he got bored with the idea of doing Genet's The Screens and did instead a play by a German writer called Peter Weiss, The Marat Sard. And from then on, I was sort of being asked for. I didn't actually have pounds.
It seems that most of the work, once you got it, once everything started rolling, was largely classical work. Is that right? I mean, or is that we just seem to...
No, it looks like that because I was with the Royal Shakespeare Company, and the name Shakespeare automatically puts it into a category of being interested only in classical work. But I was with the company that was a London end. I mean, we did mostly modern stuff, although I did do a couple of Shakespeare's. And after my 3 years with them, I think I did one play, and then I suddenly was making films all the time, and that's how it went.
Was that, the move into films, was that something that changed your own private life? I mean, the public exposure for a start must make a lot of difference.
Well, yes and no. You see, I mean, I live in England, and the English have a very, I think, healthy attitude to that kind of publicity or notoriety. I mean, there was a brief moment, I think, possibly after the first Oscar, when the press of this country thought I was going to be, that they could sell me, for whatever reason, I'm never quite sure, as Britain's little sex symbol, you see. Well, I thought that was very funny, and that lasted about 3 minutes and died a natural death. And in England, you are allowed to do your work and go home. You don't have to be a public personality all the time. You can if you want, and if your inclinations are that way, but mine aren't.
Were they ever?
So, no.
Were you ever tempted by the glitter and the glamour to...
No, I find the glitter is invariably the glitter on top of a base metal, and the glamour I can well do without.
Because people have talked about you in terms of not being a raving beauty, so, and you've acknowledged that.
There's not a lot I can do about that.
I know you've said it various times that you know, you've got used to it and you're living with it and so on. Does it ever make you wonder, though, about the success that you've had? I mean, you see so many so-called starlets who make it big as opposed to be the glamorous ones. But here's somebody who's a brilliant actress and who's got there purely by craft. Well, there must be an irony in that.
To say, well, you don't get anywhere entirely by anything. I mean, there's no one constituent factor that makes... I mean, if I hadn't been lucky enough to work with Peter Brook in that initial season, and that work hadn't got me into the Royal Shakespeare Company in a part that was a very good part so that people could see what I could do, then I would not have been given any of the other opportunities. So there are a great many areas over which one has no individual control that contribute to the opportunity being given to you in the first instance. I do agree that what you do with that opportunity after that tends to be up to you, but nobody really gets anywhere without an initial lucky break, I think.
What about the range of work that you've done? And we do associate you, certainly in Australia, with either doing sophisticated comedies in film or the historical pieces, the epic dramas and so on.
Yeah.
I imagine that it really depends on the role itself. But do you have a preference, in fact? Do you prefer to do the light work, or do you like to do the classical, historical stuff?
Well, it really is dependent on whether the part is interesting enough. And I mean, you can have an interesting part in any of the categories, really, if things go that way. Ideally, I would like most of the time to be doing what I regard as modern work. I like stuff that attempts to look at or deal with or question the society and the world we're actually living in now. It's difficult, and therefore some of the most interesting work is within the classic canon.
What was it like when you received an Academy Award? I mean, did you feel that this was justified, or was it just part of the superficial glamour of the industry?
Well, what I felt on both occasions actually was tired, because the news came to me at something like 5:45 in the morning, and I'm not at my best at that hour when the phone goes. I think it's very nice for a day. I think they're utterly erroneous in as much as it's almost impossible to define what is the best performance in that way. And I also think it's quite wrong to say that the individual recipient has won it. I mean, we don't do anything to get them. I mean, you know, you make the film probably a year before the awards are actually handed out, and you do absolutely nothing to achieve those awards. Nobody acts thinking they're going to get a prize at the end of it. And so the people who actually win are the sufficiently large number of people who voted for you. And that's very nice, but it doesn't mean anything. I mean, it doesn't make you any better. It doesn't make you any more valuable in financial terms.
Doesn't it? I thought it did.
No. And, I mean, I think it's entirely summed up by the statuette itself. My mother's got all my awards, and she's a great polisher, you know, and she's had those two little gentlemen for some time now, and they are base metal covered with a very thin layer of glittery coating, and it's eventually being worn away. And I think that about sums it all up for me.
Well, so, and then how did you feel when the second one was released?
Well, I mean, I felt astonished both times, that I was even nominated, and my response to the second one was, well, I certainly won't get it because they gave it to an English actress last year, and I couldn't see it given to an English actress 2 years running. I mean, you know, there's something... In one way, awards are quite nice, because you should be able to say, well, you know, it's your peers and they've seen the job you've done, and on a practical level it's very nice. But if they're actually seen to be anything more rather than an industry patting itself rather incestuously on the back, if that's possible, I think they can be very dangerous. There's no equation at all of anything called quality or even expertise or anything like that, I don't think.
Did it ever cross your mind to refuse them?
No, because I don't think they warrant that kind of symbolic gesture, actually. I mean, they are what they are. The most fascinating thing about the actual ceremonies, I was never at one when I got one, but I did go one year when I gave one out, and the sense of excitement and anticipation is almost unbearable when you're actually there. And the moment the envelope is opened and everybody knows who's won, they couldn't care less. I mean, it's all anticipation.
Flash is gone.
And once they know, all interest is gone. And I think that's how it should be, probably.
Yes. Now, the latest film that we're seeing you in Australia is The Return of the Soldier. And I know from chatting to you about it that that you were interested in the film for reasons other than simply the role. Can you tell us a little
I
bit
was
about it?
interested in doing it because the production company who formed it were three people that I'd worked with in their other guises in the film industry. Anne Skinner was a continuity girl. Simon Ralph was a first assistant when I worked with him, and Zelda Barron was a production manager. And they felt that they wanted to do something on a rather more basic level to reconstitute, revitalize, put some new blood into the supposedly British film industry. I say supposedly because I don't think we've got one really. It's all still a catch-as-can-can situation. And as I do feel, being English, that one should as much as possible support an English or rather British film industry, I was very keen to help them. I hasten to add that my name seemed to produce no magical results because it took them over 3 years to raise what was essentially a rather small budget to make this film. And I don't think that the names particularly helped to sell the film.
It's quite astonishing, actually, because it's a marvellous cast in the film, right
Yes,
across the board.
it's a very strong cast, really. And I think in the main it's a very good film. But I do think cinema-going habits are changing, and I think the old days of a name being able to sell anything have gone. That's probably a healthy situation. But I'm all for encouraging any attempt by British talent to make British films.
But let's just talk a little bit about the actual film itself and Margaret's character. I think that you do a marvellous job of taking her when she's sort of just alone in the house and everything, and suddenly this man comes back into her life. How easy is it to go from that sort of fairly austere, cold, dry kind of woman to then suddenly start, there's a little sparkle of light in her eyes and a little bit of warmth. And the scene when you're sitting in the tree, for instance, and the conversation near the lake.
Yes.
I mean, how do you work up to something like that?
Well, you don't really. I mean, you don't have time to work up in that sense, or to, and that's really what's exciting about a film, I think, in a way that, I mean, with that character, with Margaret, because Rebecca West, who wrote the story, was such a wonderful writer, that everything you really, as an actress, needed to know about Margaret is there in the story. I mean, she's a character that's very clearly and definitely defined. And so you know essentially what kind of person Margaret is inside. What you use to pull out that, to make clear to an audience, really, I think, in a sense, has to remain mysterious. And that's exciting about working for a film, because it's always like going off the top of a diving board, and there may or may not be water in the pool, you know, and you don't know until you get there. And so you prepare yourself as much as possible by knowing the character, knowing the situation, and then you just jump off. And of course it always helps to have someone like Alan Bates to work with, who actually tends, I think, possibly, I shouldn't really say this because I've never asked him, so I don't really know, but one senses that he works in pretty much the same way, that you do as much as you can do to prepare yourself, but you leave most of it blank, because then hopefully something will rush up to the surface.
So I described Margaret as a rather dry woman. I mean, she's been in this little cottage.
Yes.
How did you see her? Was she a woman who had a lot of potential, but it just wasn't being realised?
Well, the difficulty from an acting point of view was there were two things. One, Margaret is an essentially good person. I mean, morally and spiritually good, and that's really quite hard to play. It's very difficult. It's much, much easier to play baddies than it is to play goodies. And because the story is of Alan Bates suffering a kind of amnesia, that he can only remember her character as she was 20 years ago, what the other acting problem was to make it possible for an audience to see what he had seen in the young Margaret. If I'd simply been this drab, tired, washed-out, middle-aged woman, then he wouldn't have been suffering from amnesia. He would have been a maniac, you know. So the audience had to be able to see what he had seen, and that was quite difficult. But, you know, you just do it.
So what, in fact, is that my interpretation of the relationship between Margaret and her husband was that she really was there dutifully biding her time, and given the first chance, she probably would have been tempted by somebody.
Well, you're depressing me now, because that isn't what I played, and I didn't think I'd... No, I don't think that's true. I think the possibilities that she'd seen within her life I mean, the character Alan plays is, we are led to believe, the love of her life. But this doesn't mean to say that she isn't then capable of loving in other areas. And although the love she felt for her husband was on possibly a different level, it was nonetheless real.
It was sort of a benign kind of love.
Well, I think it was a much more equal love, in a sense, because they were the same kind of social background, which at that time in England was very important. And she was much more, he needed her in a curious way, probably rather more than the Alan Bates character needed her, because he was not as strong a man. So that there were pluses in that relationship. But I think it's always, if you come out of a relationship that's been wonderful but has gone, for whatever reasons, away or sour or whatever, that has to leave some kind of residue, some kind of wake in the person. The marvellous thing about Margaret is that she could deal with it, that she didn't become simply a dried up, embittered person. She was still living, and because she was still living, she's the one who sees at the end that Alan Bates' memory has to be returned to him. That he can't be allowed to live in this never, never land.
Yes. What I think I meant was, in the first part of the story where we see Margaret and her husband together, I saw a potential in her that she needed to have realised by some other kind of input. That's what I meant.
Yeah, well, that may be true. I mean, and I'm sure that element is there in her character, but equally, because I say she is morally and spiritually good, there would have come a point where whatever story she told herself to make her self-fulfillment complete, there would have been at some point the realization that her self-fulfillment was at the expense of somebody else, and she couldn't have carried that.
And one of the surprises of the film is, for me anyway, Anne Margaret.
Yeah.
I mean, I sort of had to keep pinching myself to see if this was Anne Margaret.
I've only ever seen her in her singing, dancing Anne Margaret role, and I really find it quite extraordinary that she does have this capacity to physically transform herself. She can become, in a curious way, whatever it is she wants to be, but for that part she also has the capacity to transform herself in an interior way. I mean, I accepted her as being English, and it's really very remarkable, I think.
Glenda is still a working gal at the age of 87. She's just completed her latest film with old friend and compatriot Sir Michael Caine, who's now 89, called The Great Escaper, reuniting with Sir Michael, also a two-time Oscar winner, after a 47-year gap. The pair originally co-starred in Joseph Losey's 1975 film The Romantic Englishman. The Great Escaper, by the way, is based on a true story.